the dictator's lies. Putin embarrassed himself again, talking about the capture of Kupiansk. Our troops managed to clear part of the city and block the occupiers. The situation in Huliaipol has worsened. Despite stabilization measures, the enemy managed to enter the northern and eastern outskirts of Huliaipol, advancing toward the center and Myrnohrad. At the limit of their strength, the city is fighting almost encircled, grinding down the enemy. Greetings to you all. This is the program Operational Duty Officer from the editorial team of Specker. We analyze facts from open sources using interactive maps. Our studio guest today, Dmytro Zhmailo, Executive Director of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation and a military observer. Greetings to you.
Greetings, Mr. Ruslin.
Nearly 200 aerial bombs along the front line, and that's just in one day. In such conditions, our soldiers are holding back the Russian onslaught, up to 200 combat engagements. The hottest spots are in the Pokrovsk and Alexandrivka directions. In the latter, the enemy is pushing toward Pokrovsk. It's tough. In the Lyman and Kostiantynivka sectors, the enemy is already in the outskirts of Kostiantynivka. They are trying to infiltrate in small groups and concentrate within the city. The city on the Roska River is being devastated by Russian aviation, which bombs it daily. And in the Lyman sector, the enemy is making advances, just as they are in Siversk. The city of Siversk is almost occupied. The enemy managed to cross the Bakhmutka River and enter the left bank. In the Huliaipol sector, the enemy managed to gain a foothold on the outskirts and advance toward the city center. Now let's talk in more detail about the most difficult directions. The QR code you see on your screens now is for the recruitment center of the separate presidential brigade named after Bohdan Khmelnytsky. It is this brigade that defends the skies over the capital. Its fighters shoot down Shaheds and missiles. The brigade has a number of combat and non-combat vacancies, so join them in defending the motherland. Scan the QR code. Please tell me, considering the scale of the enemy's movements right now, isn't the enemy running out of steam, given such a large front and such a pace? Obviously, they have enough resources for the winter campaign. In your opinion, what should we expect?
Unfortunately, we should expect even more very, very painful advances. They have been conserving this resource, and moreover, the amount of manpower we've eliminated, they have already replenished it with a slight surplus. Somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000, that's what officers from the General Staff have directly stated. It's actually beneficial for them to lose their own soldiers because it means less money is needed, and roughly speaking, the pay of a fallen soldier is transferred to a newly mobilized one. And the more of them, the more they are ground down, the better they can provide for these newly mobilized troops. So unfortunately, there will be even more very painful losses. Advancement, obviously for the Russians, Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad are very principled matters. The loss of Kupiansk hit them hard, and now they are considering whether to expand the buffer zone at the border or try to retake these positions. In other words, the main task for the Russians is to create the image of a large-scale offensive. But despite the huge numerical advantage, if we're talking about Huliaipol, that's 8 brigades and 1 division, 2 regiments plus Rubicon detachments. If we talk about the Pokrovsk direction, that's about 156,000 main forces and around 50,000 Marines in reserve. But thanks to what we're doing, creating these kinds of bottlenecks, like in Lyman, we've withdrawn to the western part. The eastern part, unfortunately, is occupied. But we're trying to drive them into the cities and repeat the story of Chasiv Yar so that we can grind them down as much as possible in these ruins. All of this is being done. Besides internal reasons, it's also a matter of the so-called peace negotiations regarding a ceasefire. The Russians understand that the Americans have now accepted their narrative, and the Americans are openly saying that they are saving the Russian state, and that a Ukrainian defeat is more acceptable to them. And that's why, through such brutal fighting, not sparing their own people, they are trying to push through and shift the balance of power on the diplomatic stage.
The Kupiansk operation by the Ukrainian armed forces came as an unpleasant surprise for the enemy. After entering the city from the north in October, the enemy created a supply corridor for their forces along the Kindrashivka-Zapadne-Holubivka line. The enemy captured these settlements, expanding the bridgehead for transferring their forces and equipment across the river. At that time, according to reports, it was not reconnaissance and sabotage groups that entered the city officially, but combat units of the 27th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 6th Combined Arms Army. If you take a look at the map, we can see the directions of the strikes and the routes of movement of the occupying forces as they entered Kupiansk. In particular, through Kindrashivka and Radkivka, they had a narrow corridor at its widest point. This corridor was about 4 kilometers wide, and it was through this corridor that all the supplies for the troops entering the city of Kupiansk were delivered, as they established themselves in the northern and central parts. So, in November, a search and strike group of Ukrainian forces was formed. From Kharkiv, the 92nd Brigade, the 475th Assault Regiment, as well as the 425th Skalia. The mission? They were tasked with pushing the enemy back to the Oskil River, so the operation began. In the area of Kindrashivka and Radkivka, we obviously understood that we needed to cut this corridor in order to block the Russian Federation military who were trying to pass through and infiltrate the battle formations. Kupianskaya. Having cleared Radkivka and Man, the defense forces, if you look at the maps, it's blue, the defense forces began to push back. The occupiers of Kupansk itself began to be swept away in the city. They began moving from the northern district, clearing house by house and heading toward the city center, where Russian Federation troops were still concentrated. Now, according to the General Staff, only a small number of Russian soldiers remain in Kupiansk. They have concentrated in the northern and to some extent southern parts. The operation is not yet complete, as the servicemen themselves have stated. But what did this show? It showed that a blow was dealt to Putin's image, as he had invited journalists and talked about a large number of battalions being surrounded in Kupiansk. In fact, the president was able to reach Kupiansk, record an address, and thank the soldiers defending the city right from the city's own monument. We have the opportunity to ask the officer of the 2nd Corps of the NGU Harty about the details of the Kupina operation on the pseudo last day. Wolf. He is the deputy commander of the search and strike group. Congratulations.
Greetings, Shkanuna Studio. Greetings, viewers.
Let me remind you about the fundraiser for the Harty soldiers who are currently working in Kupiansk. You can see the QR code on your screen. These guys are raising funds for drone equipment and electronic warfare systems. Join in, every H-Rivny accounts. Returning to the questions, please tell us, how important was it to keep the planning of the operation secret, and how did you manage to do it, considering with so many units involved, usually something leaks out somewhere, this information gets out.
The secrecy of planning and carrying out our operation was one of the key factors in our success. This level of secrecy was planned from the very beginning of the operation. Indeed, a great number of different units were involved, but we implemented a whole range of measures to mislead the enemy. So, in the end, it turned out that, in fact, until the official announcement of the operation and its publication, specifically the president's video address, the highest military and political leadership of the Russian Federation had no idea at all what was happening in the Kupiansk direction. In actual fact, at the lower echelons, there was, of course, a bit more genuine understanding. Even in those specific areas, commanders were actively being replaced. In some critical units of the Russian army, this was primarily due to significant failures in this particular direction. However, accordingly, they deliberately lied to their higher-ranking superiors, providing completely false and misleading information, which ultimately allowed us to successfully pull off such a significant and unexpected surprise.
Tell me, please, what was the hardest part of the operation? Was it cutting off their corridor near Kindrashivka, holding the riverbank, or clearing out the actual combat zone?
In reality, there were no easy parts in this operation. Everything was difficult. Again, coordinating interaction, uniting all the units under a single plan, that was actually the main idea behind our search and strike group formation. To control all these actions, to manage all of this. As for what was difficult on the battlefield, of course, we started all our actions by taking control of the pipeline through which the Russians carried out their logistics and deliveries of personnel, medicine, food, weapons, and ammunition. They regularly created new openings in this pipeline, trying to come out from new areas. We usually detected this in time, mostly with the help of drones, and destroyed the enemy. Accordingly, the fighting within the city is, of course, also not easy. Urban combat is actually one of the most difficult types of battle, because the enemy who has already entered the city has a lot of cover in front of him, and he basically moves from one shelter to another, from building to basement, from basement to building. He moves over rather short intervals of time, so it's difficult to catch him at that moment and hit him directly with drones or artillery. That's why we're now going through literally every square meter of the city, so as not to miss anyone from the enemy personnel.
Please tell me, following up on this question, given the current situation in the city, are you able to find the enemy in the numbers that were mentioned? Do they surrender, or do they fight to the last?
Right now, the situation in the city is fully under the control of the defense forces, specifically our group and our allies. The enemy is surrendering. Because in fact, surrender is the only way out left for them, the only way they can get out of the situation they found themselves in within the city. Currently, the enemy group in the city numbers about 200 servicemen, and this number is decreasing every day. We are advancing, locating the enemy, and eliminating them, so their situation is quite dire.
Thank you very much for these details. We had the opportunity to ask an officer from the 2nd Corps of the National Guard of Ukraine, Hartin callsign Vok, about the details of the Kupiansk operation. He is the deputy commander of the search and strike group. Let me remind you about the fundraiser for the soldiers from Harti who are currently operating in Kupiansk. You can see the QR code on your screen. It's for equipping drones and for spare parts for electronic warfare systems. Join in. Dmytro, please tell us, considering the current situation in Kupiansk, what are the consequences for the enemy of losing Kupiansk? So are these consequences more internal or external? How might this affect international policy and Russia itself? After all, Moscow is now trying to wriggle out of this and is already coming up with various stories about whether or not he was there, whether or not the president was in Kupiansk.
Absolutely. If we talk about the situation on the ground, as our Western partners like to say, we remember that their main goal was to take Kupiansk and move further south to Kupiansk-Vuzlovy, because in 2022, Kupiansk-Vuzlovy was a major logistics base for them, when personnel, equipment, and ammunition were being transported directly by rail from Russia. And in this way, they wanted, roughly speaking, to put pressure from the north on Donetsk region, to push from the north on Sviatohirsk as well, and thus create these large pincers. Now, after this, they actually have several options. Either they will be redeployed to Russian territory because they want to create this red line, a parody of a sanitary zone between Vovchansk and essentially Kupiansk, or they will be redeployed to other directions because on the same Pokrovsk and Hulyapol axis there are huge forces, but even so, from time to time, they still get exhausted. Or they will try to regain all their lost positions so that later they can justify it as a certain tactical or operational tactical withdrawal. As for the international situation, our European partners see this, they take it as an argument, but the United States of America, they have now taken a position, roughly speaking, represented by Witkov, this kind of pro-Russian wing. They have a grand plan, a big deal to restore the Russian Federation. They are saving it, and they say this openly, despite all the political damage. And what does this mean for us? Everyone says that we have a lot of problems in the army, and we could fall apart, because there are issues with mobilization, with people, with the supply of weapons and ammunition, problems everywhere. But if the Americans have started acting this way, it means the Russians have similar problems. And the Americans, for them, our defeat is more acceptable than the collapse of the Russian state, because basically they have no vision of what to do with that territory. That's why we're under a lot of pressure right now. Unfortunately, they have many allies, structures in Ukraine that took American money and are working for this. Some media are working for this, and we can see where this is leading. 3 to 4 years, we need this freeze. It would be good for us. And according to the plan, in these 3 to 4 years, the Russians recover, economic ties with the US are restored. In the fields of nuclear energy and space, this cooperation never actually stopped. Well, and for us, they'll gradually turn off the aid tap so as not to escalate things with Moscow so that we, God forbid, don't produce drones and strike with them during the ceasefire. The next step? The Americans tell a terrified Europe, buy our weapons. You have no other options, just look at what happened to Ukraine. Russia is recovering, and as for us, we're basically leaving the stage altogether. The Europeans are paying for this war with our blood. How big are their budgets? 100, 200 times bigger. How did it happen on a global scale that we have less money for the war than the Russians? They're just watching as we grind each other down so that we end up weakened by this war. And whenever we're short on something, they just toss us a couple of coins, nothing more. That's why any successes like the Kupiansk operation are extremely important. And right now, what's important, first of all, is supporting the president's diplomatic efforts, his determination, and the consolidation of society. Because if the Americans realize that the scheme they're currently pushing is failing, believe me, there will be a reset in the Oval Office and they'll start coming up with new concepts. But why aren't the Americans reacting right now? Because they genuinely believe that the forces are unequal and that they will be able to break us. That's why they're staying silent. But the more of these pauses we have, the faster we'll move forward. This kind of reset, just like we did when the Trump administration first came to power.
Despite the demonstrations by Russian rags in Pokrovsk, the enemy has not been able to fully capture the city. Fighting continues in the northwestern and northeastern parts. In the center, east, and south of the city, the enemy has concentrated its units from the 2nd and 41st Combined Arms Armies. Overall, in this sector, the enemy has more than 150,000 personnel. The battle map for Pokrovsk looks as follows. The enemy is moving north from the 0504 highway. We can see this gray zone here. They are moving north, also advancing northwest toward Hryshyn, and also moving toward Rivne and Rodenske. These are the enemy forces of the 2nd Combined Arms Army. They are trying to link up with their units concentrated in Rodenske and Chervony Lyman. It is clear that the enemy intends to block one of the roads. This is the highway, here it is. 0515, in fact, along which, or rather between which, our troops could have an exit from the Myrnohrad area. So now, by attacking the northern outskirts, the streets, these are Naberezhna, Svobody, and Nevskoho streets. If you look, these are roughly the streets. This is how they look. This is approximately how our defense is laid out. The enemy is also moving toward the service center. Here is the service center. The enemy wants to reach Rivne as quickly as possible. Right now, they are moving along the T0504 highway toward Myrnohrad on both sides of this road. We can see that Rivne and Svitle are already in the gray zone, but our defenders are holding these settlements because Svitle, for example, is holding back the advance to the north of Myrnohrad. The enemy from the north, who has concentrated their efforts from Chervony Lyman, is trying, so to speak, to completely create this pocket in Myrnohrad. If we look at the map a bit further west, we can also see enemy advances in the area of Kotlin and Udakhne. In the strategic area of Kotlin, the enemy forces are also steadily advancing along the main railway line towards this critical highway, Pokrovsk-Pavlohrad. They are trying to reach the highway as far west as possible and cut it off. The enemy is directing part of their efforts towards Hryshyn. The video that appeared online showing burned equipment from the convoy, it's precisely this road in the direction of Hryshyn where our troops are holding the defense. From Udakhne, the enemy is targeting Molodetske and the area near the settlement of Mezhova. This is the direction they've chosen for themselves, along which they are advancing. As for Myrnohrad itself, despite the General Staff's statements that it is not encircled, if you look at the interactive maps, it turns out that the city is actually already in a pocket. The city is holding on, as it is resisting the enemy's superior forces. The enemy is moving along the T0504 highway, again the economic route. They've simply crashed into the eastern outskirts of the city. There were also advances from the area of the settlement of Kozatske, and also from Balahana. All these enemy intentions are directed toward the city center. Right now, the enemy has actually already managed to reach. There are ponds here in the city. In fact, fighting is already taking place near these ponds. The enemy wants to reach the city center, where the city council is located. This is what can be seen, again, for ideological reasons, in order to establish some kind of their rag and demonstrate their presence. The situation is difficult, but as the General Staff says, it is under control. It's also not accurate to say that Pokrovsk is already in the enemy's hands, because in the north, I repeat, our soldiers are holding the defense, and in Myrnohrad itself, the defense is also holding. This gives our troops the opportunity to grind down a significant portion of the enemy's forces and resources, especially those reserves that are being thrown in. The Russian occupiers, we have the opportunity to ask Ivan Popov, an officer of the 3rd Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine, Spartan, about the situation west of Pokrovsk. Ivan Popov, greetings to you.
I wish you good health.
Let me remind you about the fundraiser for the brigade. Our viewers, the guys need Mavics, so please join in. You can see the payment details on your screen. Every contribution is very important. Mr. Ivan, please tell us, how much has the logistics become more complicated in your area near Pokrovsk, considering their advances and the increase in these risks?
Logistics have become more complicated due to the high activity of FPV drones on fiber optics, and, so to speak, those who are just sitting and waiting for equipment. That's why the approach of our equipment has been stretched to 4 to 7 kilometers. But we are using alternatives. These are ground-based robotic systems that can deliver supplies, evacuate the wounded, or move to another position as needed. But if we really need to, Armored vehicles, APCs, or IFVs will go wherever necessary to complete the mission.
Tell me, please, large reserves of enemy Marines are currently being redeployed. Have you already felt the impact of these reserves appearing in your sector?
The enemy is constantly replenishing their personnel, so we always notice when there are newly arrived troops. They undergo training for 2 to 3 weeks and are then sent to carry out combat missions. And
how well prepared is the enemy that is opposing us in your sector? Are there many of these enemy forces now, and are they using equipment? Yes, there are.
Regarding the enemy's training, there are different units, and each of them has a different level of preparation. There are those who have already been serving for 2 or 3 years. And judging by the prisoners we have captured, they told us about this, where they carried out their missions. But the majority are those newcomers, so to speak, who trained for 3 weeks and then came to fight against us. But we stop them and take them prisoner. As for the enemy's logistics, we have cut them off by 10 to 15 kilometers because we constantly have reconnaissance drones on duty. And if we detect them, we make sure to strike so that they can't move anywhere else.
Please tell us, looking at the maps, we wanted to clarify whether these advances are accurate. Has the enemy advanced in the area of Udachne, the Molodetske direction, Mezhova, or are there actually no advances there? By the enemy,
there is no enemy advance, but you understand yourself that last month the enemy made heavy use of fog. They tried to approach our positions, bypass them, or get between our positions to entrench themselves, build up forces, and continue further actions. There have been numerous instances when the enemy managed to skillfully infiltrate between our established positions and remained concealed there for an entire week, deliberately not revealing themselves at all. However, a dedicated search and assault group during their meticulous operations successfully discovered and decisively eliminated them.
Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for what you do. With information about the current situation, we have arrived at Western Pokrovsk. Officer Ivan Popov of the 3rd Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine, Spartan, is reporting. We're donating to the guys for Mavics. You can see the payment details on your screen. Dimitro, please tell me, is there any point in holding on right now? Myrnohrad, even though it's practically surrounded already.
For now, it still makes sense to hold on. Myrnohrad. Here, unfortunately, it's the very harsh mathematics of war. In this direction, the Russians outnumber us by 6 to 10 times. And that's why we're trying to maintain the matchbox effect for as long as possible. If we're talking about Pokrovsk, the northern part along the railway has been taken, and accordingly along the highway so that they don't break through. If we're talking about Myrnohrad, it's the same situation. This is a very important defensive point. There is a very delicate point here. So that accordingly we don't pull out too early because the Russians will rush further north and run into our defensive structures. But there could be the same effect as after Avdiivka, when we held them for a long time in a narrow bottleneck and then they broke through it with corpses. Literally with corpses, no exaggeration. There were 70,000 killed and they quickly spread out over a large area. They took it, turned it into a logistics hub, and in this way began to push westward. So the command understands that this will be the same situation. And the main thing is to make sure that as few Russians as possible reach the next line of defense. Regarding what is happening, from my personal conversations with officers of the General Staff, they are constantly trying to carry out stabilization measures between Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. In particular, the 25th Airborne Brigade was operating and advancing there. It is quite a powerful unit. And from time to time, FPV drone operators go out and try to clear the bottleneck. All logistics, at least more than half of it, is provided by bombers and ground robotic systems. Sometimes supplies are delivered on foot. Any kind of equipment simply cannot get through there right now. The Russians have a significant advantage in fiber optics. We don't have that. Our advantage is in bombers. The Russians haven't created anything. So bombers drop ammunition, bombers drop food supplies, and that's how we manage to hold on. But attention, both from society and everyone else, must be especially focused on this point, because this is a very risky operation. It's a very brutal mathematics of war, so it will really be necessary to pull back and build another line of defense. But as long as Myrnohrad holds, it allows us to keep them contained in this direction.
Russia has deployed 2 full armies, the 5th and 36th, in the Yuliaipol direction, as well as about 6 brigades from the 29th and 35th Combined Arms Armies. Today, the Yuliaipol direction, or the eastern Zaporyzhia front, is like this. Having broken through our defenses, let's look at the map in the area of Uspenivka, as we can see here, and in the area of Solotke, the enemy has created the conditions for advancing from the north toward Huliaipole. Along the bank of the Yancha River in the direction of Yehorivka, and here we see Vishneve, the enemy is trying to put pressure on Danilivka. Why? In order to reach the confluence of the two rivers at the place where the Hovcha and Haichur meet, and also in the area, this is approximately near the settlement of Andrivka, with further movement toward the highway in order to reach and cut it near Pokrovsk. The enemy is advancing in a concentrated manner along the entire section of the field. If we consider the area of combat engagement, this whole section, to Alexandrorad, that's more than 40 kilometers. Moreover, the intensity along this section of the front is very high, both in the area of Alexandrorad, in the area of Novoselivka, as well as in the area of Yehorivka, and also in the area of Rivnopilia, as we can see. Right now, this salient is very important because our defense will essentially be positioned along the direction of Prailuki, Varvarivka, and Zelene. The enemy, why is he directing his strikes this way? He wants to cut off one of the key roads that runs from Pokrovsk to Huliaipole. That's why these settlements will now bear the brunt of the main attack. As for Huliaipole itself, the enemy is advancing from the direction of Zaporyzhia toward the northern outskirts of Huliaipole, also from the area of Zeleny High toward the eastern outskirts, and from Merpopil toward the southern outskirts. The situation in the city right now, since the enemy has penetrated into the city, urban combat has already begun. And according to information from other interactive maps, part of the enemy has even managed to reach the central part of the city, although they have not established a foothold there yet. The enemy is creating the conditions, so to speak, for a breakthrough if they manage to break through our defenses in the Varvarivka area. By the way, Russian flags were also spotted there, but as it turned out, it was just a raid by a sabotage group. They took a photo with the flag and then either ran away or didn't, but they're not there anymore. So Varvarivka is ours, but the enemy's direction toward Zaporyzhia will look as follows. They will move along both sides of the road, advancing towards Zaporyzhia from the southeast, that is operating on both sides of the road, Zaporizhia Donetsk. Please tell us, Dmitro, so the breakthrough in the area of Yehorivka and Verbove, what we are seeing, can the enemy really bypass it? Then there's this Orikhiv salient, which we are currently holding successfully and not allowing the enemy to advance. Neither in the area of Novodanilivka nor in the area of Orikhiv, right?
At this stage, that's definitely possible. The Russians most likely understand that water obstacles, as you correctly said, will move in the direction of the roads. But this stretching out always plays a very cruel joke on them because they try to push as far forward as possible. They also have propaganda objectives. You mentioned the flags. Yes, they also place them using drones trying to imitate these flags. To create the impression of capturing large territories, that's why I don't think they'll be able to do all this quickly right now. Their plan is quite obvious. They want to bypass the defensive structures. Moreover, many officers from the general staff even say that the defensive structures need to be monitored, because the problem is that we can't saturate those positions with enough infantry. The Russians push us out and then take over the well-built defensive structures, and then carrying out any counterattacks becomes extremely difficult, because we end up storming our own fortifications. There's a clear understanding, again, like a magic wand, effective units have been redeployed here. FPV drones and once again assault troops have been sent in. You see, they're moving forces all along the front line from Sumy region to Huliaipole, trying to stabilize everything. But the forces involved are truly significant. And here, in particular, there's information that a large portion of their equipment as well, they've concentrated it here too. That's about 200 tanks. They've exhausted all their own reserves. They have only 23 T-80S left, and as for the modernized T-72s, up to 200 units. And now this entire armada is basically concentrated here. And under the cover of fog, they'll try to use this equipment and break through. But the difficult terrain and the fact that the main force is concentrated specifically near Huliaipole, it's possible, but it will definitely be very, very drawn out.